Welcome to the Humour in Games podcast, an analog and video games podcast about how humor is experienced, designed, and analyzed in games.
We are Scott DeYoung,
Mark Lajeunesse,
and Andre Zanescu,
and we'll be your guides in this 6-episode series. Throughout each episode, we'll break down different theories and forms of humor. We'll draw on interviews with designers, critics, and academics as they discuss the different aspects of humor, their own lived experiences, and how their work utilizes humor in games. Today we talk with Osama Dorias, a lead game designer at Warner Bros. Interactive, about considerations of humor within AAA game studios.
Can you just tell us a little bit about yourself and who you are?
Absolutely. So my name is Osama Dorias. I'm the lead game designer at Warner Bros. Games in Montreal. We just recently announced which game I'm working on, so I'm the lead game designer on Gotham Knights. Also, I was the coordinator of the video game programs at Dawson College. I authored the independent game design program. Now I am a teacher in that program, so I've stepped down as coordinator. And, in addition to that, I'm the co-founder of the Montreal Independent Game Awards, previously the Montreal Independent Game Festival, but we rebranded. This year, we're taking a year off, but otherwise it would have been our 6th year as a festival. Family man, happily married, father to 3 kids. I guess that's enough.
Yeah. I mean, in the same line, like, how did you get into game studies yourself, or work in games?
It's actually, I didn't study games. I studied political science. I don't think you were able to study games back when I was in school. I worked as a shipping agent for several years. So basically, my job consisted of going on ships, meeting captains, shaking their hands. That was the fun part. And the rest of it was doing customs paperwork, and that was not the fun part. So after a while, I stopped doing that, and I went back to a passion I had when I was younger, which was graphic and web design. And I was 100% self-taught. I picked up one of those Learn Graphic Web Design in 21 Days books, and I did it in a weekend, crunched it, and made websites for my dad's business, and then his friends wanted me to make websites for them. So it was a source of income while I was going through school anyway, and I found that I enjoyed it more than being a shipping agent. That taught me Flash, and that made me make games, since I was making levels for games since I was really young anyway. So that transitioned to making really, really crappy Flash games. But that's a portfolio when most people didn't have a portfolio, and that landed me my first job. I had applied to hundreds of companies. At least that's how I remember it. It could have been dozens, but it felt like hundreds. And I got one call back, one interview, and I landed that one job. The callback was interesting because it was close to when I was it was 6 months after I started applying. Back then, that felt like a long time. Now I realize a lot of people really do, even struggle longer than that to try to find their job, like the first job in their wanted career. Mm-hmm. But back then I was like, oh my God, 6 months. I was debating whether I was going to keep going or if I'd give up. I didn't get even a single interview at that point. Then Gameloft contacted me, and they wanted to ask me if I was a poker expert, because they needed a poker expert for an upcoming poker video game they were working on. I played casually with friends, not even for money, because I don't gamble. But I was like, yeah, I'm your poker expert. They're like, okay, we have a test on Friday. So I went to the bookstore and I bought a whole bunch of poker books, and I didn't sleep for 2 days, and I aced the test. Apparently I was the only one who aced it because and I lived on imposter syndrome for 3 years. I was at Gameloft for almost 7 years, but for the first 3 years I had crippling imposter syndrome because I literally lied to get my job, and I felt horrible about that. It's not a thing I normally would do, but I was so desperate. And so I took my boss for lunch, and at lunch I told him, hey, listen, I have something to tell you. He's like, what is it? Is your wife pregnant, or are you changing jobs? What's going on here? Because that's the default that I need to talk to, thing that he gets. And I said, no, I lied about being a poker expert. He's like, I know that, you dummy. What are the chances of finding a poker expert? We were just looking for anyone who's willing to learn to do the work. I mean, you only worked on one poker game. After that, you worked on a multitude of different games. I needed someone who could adapt quickly. And I'm like, why the hell was I living with this anxiety for 3 years? I should have just come up and said it right away.
That's really funny. Jumping into games now, and humorous games, because that's our focus here. When you think of a funny game, what's a game that comes to your mind?
It's hard to narrow it down to just one, because there's 2 different categories of humor in games that or different approaches to humor in games that I would think of almost simultaneously. One is like the game writing is good, like the dialogue is good, the delivery is good, it's funny. And the first one that comes to mind is like either Portal 1 or Portal 2, the Portal series. I find those games hilarious. Just in GLaDOS and her dialogue. Like there are other contenders, but those are the first ones that come to mind. But the other is like in terms of the mechanics, or like how the actual realization of the game itself, like some kind of emergent humor. I would think of Octodad. Have you ever played Octodad?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Like that kind of game. Like specifically Octodad's probably the first one that comes to mind. I don't know if it's the funniest one I've played, but it's impossible to play Octodad and not laugh. You can't. I mean, maybe if you play it alone, but if you play in co-op, there's no way you don't laugh. It's made for you to laugh. Even you're laughing through frustration sometimes. So,
Yeah.
that's like the two broad categories. And Octodad had some funny writing too, but it's mostly about the actual emergent humor that comes out of the mechanics.
Yeah, would you say there's a game that kind of does a bit of both really well, where like the narrative kind of plays into the mechanics quite nicely?
That's a good question. My first instinct was to say Goat Simulator, but Goat Simulator doesn't have much of a narrative. I don't know why it's the first one that popped in my mind, but that was like the other, like similar to Octodad. But you're a goat. I guess that's still a narrative in a way.
Kind of just sticking with what you were saying with Octodad, because you're saying like it might not be funny in person, but it's definitely funny in co-op. One of the things that we've been kind of talking about is how humor changes from like single player games to multiplayer games.
Yes.
And so in your experience, like what are kind of some differences there, and in either design thoughts or just the games themselves?
Well, I mean, in general, I've seen some research that indicates that people have an easier time laughing already when there's just a group around. Like even going to watch a comedy, like just a movie, a non-interactive movie, if you're in a group and you hear other people laugh, you're much more inclined to be laughing anyway. So already that is a layer on top of it all. But it's also like the games that have emergent humor, like similar to Octodad, you trying to do a thing and failing is funny, but could be frustrating. But the unpredictableness of what your co-op partners are going to do is another layer on top of that you can't get from single player experience. Like, hey, how about you do this? No, I meant the other thing. That by itself is humorous. It sets you up for a laugh. So I think just the these not the written the jokes, the landing. If you can't hear the other, like it's more about if it's landing for the other person and you hear them laugh and it becomes a little contagious. It's not the same, and a lot of those maybe they're a little more personal. You want to spend more time exploring the world and like engaging in the narrative, which we do. We're less likely to do when we're playing co-op. Like I know I love games like Divinity 2. I don't know if you're familiar with it. It's like,
I personally haven't, but
okay. So it's similar to like Baldur's Gate, for example. It's that kind of game. I've played Divinity alone, single player, and I've played it in co-op. And what I find is when I play it alone, I'm really into the story. I really want to talk to everybody and like get a sense of the world. When I play it in co-op, that kind of goes out the window, and I can't really explain why because I'm a very narrative-focused person. So when you're playing a single player, you're in control of who you're talking to, and you're able to not miss a thing, or at least decide what's worth your attention or not. But when you play a game like that in co-op, one of your friends can wander off, talk to somebody, and you're going to miss that dialogue. So I think that the impact of missing things from that, like it makes what you're able to. It just makes the experience very different. We're like, oh, okay, well, whatever. I'm missing a whole bunch of the story anyway. That's not what I'm playing for, and it puts you in a different mind frame for that. So I think any kind of narrative-driven game that leans into humor, if it's co-op, I think will suffer from the same thing. You're either forcing everybody to, like, you're pausing the screen and you're showing everybody the joke, which is like disruptive, and it's not the best way to introduce a joke. The person not engaging in it themselves or deciding or like listening to it on their own terms. They're being snapped to that line of dialogue, which robs it a little bit of its humor. Or you allow everyone to go off on their own, and that also takes you away from the narrative, and you become much more focused on, like in the case of Divinity 2, the RPG elements, the leveling up, the combat, because those are shared experiences that like actually are enhanced by co-op, and not the co-op experience doesn't detract from it.
Building on that as well, how does like spectatorship, influencer culture, stream culture now play into kind of designing games that are funny? Like, do you as a designer or on part of the design team consider like how this will be picked up by like game influencers and how they might show it on their like YouTube or Twitch channels?
I've actually never worked on a game that focused on that specifically. I worked on For Honor, for example. For Honor has a bit of humor. There were a few jokes here and there, but it's mostly grimdark, serious type of combat game. And even though we did expect streamers to play it, we expected streamers not to so much to engage with a single player campaign, but more to play the multiplayer, because it's a fighting game, right? I've never made a game for streamers. It's not a thing that I in my career that I've considered.
Yeah, no, that's a very fair point. Now you mentioned For Honor. You're also like now taking the lead on the new Batman game. Those games are kind of dark and gritty, as you mentioned. And so, is like when you're making a game like that, how do you consider humor playing into that environment, if at all?
Well, from my point of view, right now, I mean, I haven't been a narrative designer for quite a while now. I think it's about 6 or 7 years ago that I was a narrative designer. My focus has been a lot more on system design or gameplay. But I can still tell you, like from experience, from what I see from the dev team, even if it's not my personal experience, basically it comes in layers, in many, many layers. It comes all the way from the top, from the creative director, where the creative director has to create documents and make presentations to tell you what the tone of the game is. I've never worked on a game where the tone was no humor whatsoever. Never explicitly mentioned. I've worked on a few games where humor was integral to the design, but most of the time it's like a tone that accommodates humor. Like, yeah, we're able to have jokes in here or this or that. We oftentimes, if there are multiple characters, one of them will be the humorous one, just because it's an easy differentiation between them, and that usually manifests itself in wisecracks. While the character is, just regular navigation or whatever they do, combat or things like that. And we saw that when I worked at Gameloft on Dungeon Hunter. We had character archetypes, and some of the character archetypes would be written and voice cast with that in mind. So that's already a thing. The second thing is you have a lot of contributors, and a lot of people, their personalities come out in the art that they create, or in their craft. So we have a lot of level designers. I remember one level designer in particular that I worked with at Gameloft absolutely loved humor and tried to integrate it into the level design as much as possible. So when he would specifically work with level artists, he would tell them, oh, and it would be great if when you arted this part up, you put in this Easter egg or this thing that players, if they see, they're going to laugh, they're going to crack up because, misdirection or misleading or whatever. And you'd have other level designers who did not even register, did not even click. Doesn't mean it wouldn't make it into their level. It often would mean that if it came up in a review and a level design director would say, hey, this would be funny, let's put this here, then it would make it in. But then almost by default, you'd see that their levels would have fewer environmental storytelling elements that were humorous, just because that's not who they are as a craftsperson. And that's okay too. Like, that's why you have a lot of variety, and that's why different people have different preferences to characters and levels. But it's you could see it, like, it's layered. It really is. It's like it starts from the top. The creative director decides what the tone is, and polices, I guess, that tone, or enforces that tone. Then other directors also apply the same tone throughout. So, for example, an animation director would make sure that the emotes of this character will never be humorous, because that is the grim dark one. But the other one, he can flip you the bird or do something else, or juggle and drop a ball, or whatever they find humorous based on the direction of that character. And then it'll go all the way down to the animator themselves, who are like, hey, how about we give them a selfie? That would be hilarious, especially in a fantasy setting where cell phones didn't exist. That's a joke right there in itself. So I'm going to propose this. Sometimes it comes up in the concept art. It can come from any different directions. I'm on the project that I'm on now. We actually have a page where it's like to just Easter eggs, and many of the suggestions just happen to be A lot of them were just like fan service. Hey, fans would like this,
Yeah.
but many of them are just this would be hilarious. Doesn't mean they're necessarily going to make it in, but people love that page. They go back to it a lot, either to contribute or to take stuff from it.
Right.
Yeah.
So what do you think like Humor offers in like a dark game like For Honor?
It's actually, if you have the same tone throughout, you're not doing anyone any favors, because basically, uh, if everything is dark, then nothing is dark. That just becomes your new normal. So humor not only gives you relief from the tone, but it's a kind of a palate cleanser that allows players to re-engage with the original intended tone of the game. I could give an example from a movie that you might have seen. Have you ever watched Terminator Salvation?
Yeah.
Okay, so in Terminator Salvation, I'm not going to speak to the movie a lot, but I'll give it as an example. Um, the there was no joy in that movie. Everything was dark. Everyone was sad all the time. The entire movie, everyone had a frowny face. Nobody was laughing. There was no moment of a break from that grim dark. And because of that, what ends up happening is, for me at least, from my point of view, I felt disconnected with the characters. I didn't want them to. I didn't really care so much if they survived or not, because their life was miserable throughout. So even if they survive this one encounter, they're going to go back to their miserable lives. So you need to have some kind of contrast. You need to be like, you know what, times are tough, but look, I just had a watermelon and threw the peel at your face, and we shared a laugh. This is a fun moment. Life is worth living. Let's laugh about this, and then fight off the alien invading horde, so that we have a chance to throw more watermelon peels at each other, or whatever it is. Like that it's a little bit of a break, a palate cleanser, and allows you to re-engage with the intended tone to begin with. So you just have to be careful, because if you overdo it, then that becomes your new tone and not the break from the tone. So it's like a balancing act, right?
Yeah, no, that makes complete sense. No, that also makes a lot of sense for like games like that have like a very dark theme, to use it as kind of bringing in that hope or kind of counteracting that typical emotion. But how do you see perhaps humor playing across different genres of games or different styles of games? I don't like, you seem to have an array of games that you've worked on, so I don't know how many genres you can speak to. But I mean, is there kind of a difference in humor across these types of games?
Yeah, it was okay. So I worked on another game called The Other Room. It's a VR escape room game, and the spoiler. I'm sorry, I'm going to spoil it to everyone. But in the game is presented as a training module. So basically, you put on the helmet, and then you are going through these series of escape rooms to see how good you are at finishing escape rooms. So it's kind of like a test, right? But the hidden narrative, is eventually you are told, like you're led to believe that there's an sentient AI who's studying humans, and you are being tested in that sense. Like basically, this is real. It's not a game. You're in it, and the AI is learning about us. It is sentient now. So of course, it's not funny on its own. It's actually very unsettling, and a lot of the imagery that you have in the game is meant to be unsettling for that reason. And the game was popular. We got actually pretty good reviews. We used humor there to break the tension a little bit, again, as a palate cleanser. So it's not a grim dark, but it's still similar. We're going from unsettling to doing something funny to disarm you a little bit, so that when we go back to unsettling, you have to re-engage with that feeling all over again. What else did I work on? Well, Heroes Never Lose is another game that I had mentioned to you before, which is an action puzzler, and it's a parody game. The game itself is I love superheroes. Even before I started working at Warner Brothers, I've loved superheroes, and there's proof of that, because this is from like 6 years ago. And the characters themselves are parodies of known characters. So it was intended to appeal to people who like superheroes to begin with, and who know about like that subject matter, and are able to have this moment where they can share a laugh together, because they know what this is alluding to. They know that this is poking fun at tropes. Like, for example, Natman is the name of one of the characters, which is poking fun at both Batman and Spider-Man, because their animals are like bats and spiders. They're supposed to be scary, but they're little furry things, right? I know
Yeah.
people don't usually think about spiders as something furry, but you know what I mean.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so how do we like push that one level further? Well, there's Gnatman. It's a gnat. It's even more ridiculous than that. There's also Pronto, who's probably my favorite character. Pronto works at Pronto Pizza. He's a pizza delivery person who goes super fast, and so fast, in fact, that he can stop crime between deliveries. Like little jokes like that, or Gun Nut, who literally shoots nuts out of his gun. Some of them are like different types of gags that they're kind of one-offs, but they allow you to like understand that these are like tropes from superheroes. The characters become kind of instantly familiar. And people can laugh about it. Whenever we had trade shows, people would come, like look at the characters, ask about them, laugh, and then sit down to play. So it would almost be a way to welcome people in through humor, but it would also make them more engaged with finding out more about the narrative of the story. Maybe there's a few more laughs in there.
And so kind of building on like that the discussion around like Spider-Man, Batman, superheroes. I know that you can't talk about Batman and Son, so I don't know how much you can answer this question, but we were kind of curious how humor works when you're dealing with like large copyrighted images such as Batman, or you did a game with like Mickey Mouse. Like, do you have to consider the original artist's intent or creator's intent around humor there? Like, how much freedom do you have in kind of adding your own humor into like designing around those kind of copyrighted
Well,
characters?
I did, like you mentioned, I worked on with Disney IPs in the past as well, and with DC IPs now. One thing that's been consistent throughout is they control, rightfully so, what you're able to do with their characters. So there's like a system where you have to check in periodically and ask for permission, but eventually you get a feel for it, so you check in less, if that makes sense. So you're like, okay, you know what? We wanted to go with this direction. This direction is kind of new for Mickey, for example. You have to answer the big questions at first. You give him a voice. Who is their voice actor? All these things have to be approved. Then once you, like, let's say you want a specific kind of joke to happen, eventually you start feeling more comfortable saying, okay, well, this is a similar type of joke. They're going to be okay with this one as well. You get a feel for it, and there are less checks that go in as the project proceeds. Usually, most of the time, all these sync ups and check-ins happen at the very, very beginning to make sure everybody's aligned. But once alignment happens, you only check in with anything that you're not sure about. And you do that because you don't want to redo work. You don't want to like come in late in the project and they're like, well, rewrite this whole section. That doesn't work. So there's kind of already a mutually beneficial reason to make sure that all parties involved are for it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, that does. And like on the same similar kind of point, do you guys consider like fan reactions to these things as well? I mean, a lot of the things you're working on have like huge fan bases. So are you kind of considering like, will the fans find this funny? Will the fans find this offensive? Things like that?
We actually check all the time. For anything offensive, we have consultants always, all the time, like to make sure that any of the content that we create won't be offensive. In terms of whether it's humor or not, any kind of content that we that touches a group, especially a kind of marginalized group that we don't have anyone on the dev team who's part of that group, we always have consultants to make sure that they sign off on it. And if they don't sign off on it, we make changes and we check with them early enough. We have to do that because otherwise, like I said, the cost is too big to cut content later. There's a business case for checking. And I'm glad for that because it means we make games that don't offend people as much as possible. In terms of does this joke land, we play test all the time. We do market research all the time. Like any trailer that you've seen in the world premiere, yes, the world public premiere, but you know how many private viewings we've had of those to make sure that people actually like it, like early on. You'd be shocked. Like there are play sessions that happen with gameplay. There are with trailers, with anything, just to make sure that these are hitting the right. Because we get too close to the content itself, we become the worst judges of that content. Because like the funniest joke in the world, if you hear it 3 times, it's already not funny. Just 3 times. So
Yeah.
at that point, you're like, I'm not sure if this is not funny for me, this is not funny for anyone else. And other times it's the other way around, where you put something in, but wasn't really intended to be funny, and people start chuckling, and you're like, hey, can I lean into this more? Focus the camera more on this, like draw it out and make that like the new focus. So all that happens through playtesting. Especially with humor, you can't just like gut feeling it the whole way through. It's like humor doesn't age well, if you follow what I mean.
Yeah, no, exactly. And like, are there times though where it doesn't hit? Like where you guys have done all the playtesting and a game still comes out and you find that it still doesn't hit with the community? I know I've heard stories of games that have done that. I'm curious if that's your own experience.
From my experience, I haven't really gotten that. I know that I've seen some people play through, like the other room is a good example. I've watched walkthroughs of the other room where the person did not react in either way to the unsettling things or to the humor, and just was like sitting through it and like with a blank stare throughout and commenting just on the gameplay. I've seen that, and that was you get used to it after a while. You're like, okay, that's just a person's personality, just not an emotive person. But I've never, thankfully, I've never experienced well, that was a bad joke. Like,
Yeah.
like that I haven't had yet, and hopefully I'll never have. I don't want to I don't want to sit through that. But
No,
the
of course
most I've
not.
had is a joke just happened and the person didn't react. I guess that wasn't funny. But the other video, the other person reacted, so maybe that's just not funny to everyone. That's like the closest I've had to that,
Right.
and
And
that's
then
normal. Humor doesn't hit everybody all the time. Not everybody laughs at the same things, right?
well, exactly. And so I'm kind of curious, do you guys have like a target group that you're kind of trying to design humor around? I mean, it probably varies between game to game, but
Yeah, it definitely varies between game to game. And to be honest, we target, like for bigger games, we target everyone. It's mainstream, so we'll have the jokes for the fans of the previous games, the joke for the fans who like the comic book content, the jokes that the kids will like, the jokes that the older people will appreciate. Like I say jokes, but you mean any kind of humor, right? So we'll target everyone all the time, and it almost doesn't matter. That's why I was talking about Easter eggs. Easter eggs are not for everyone, right? Easter eggs, if you notice them, like it means that you generally means that you've had access to some of our other content before, and that's why you recognize them to begin with, or that you spent more time researching either us as people, or the studio, or the characters, or anything for an Easter egg to hit. Not all humor has to hit all the time.
right.
Not all references have to all the time.
Yeah. Humor sometimes can get political very quickly. And so like how careful are you guys around the jokes that are in the game and seeing how it might be interpreted in a different way?
Our narrative teams that are like any narrative team that I've worked with, that's a top priority to make sure that we're not offending anyone or misleading people to believe anything. We actually have a lot of we have legal departments in every video game company I've worked on that check certain things if we're allowed to say them or allowed to do them. But we also encourage our own team to raise any flags. We have the play tests as well, and if we ask people if there's anything that doesn't hit right. We have the consultants. We have so many ways to check if we are saying something inappropriate, that the chances of something slipping in, it's not impossible, of course. We're human beings and mistakes happen, but the chances of something slipping in and passing every single gate that we have in place, it becomes very, very, very slim.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And I'm kind of also just curious about like sometimes designers they're not intending or thinking in any way that like the mechanics of the game could set something up, but then like a streamer plays the game and they find ways to play around with corpses that is really inappropriate, but on their
Yeah.
stream it's seen as really funny. Like are those kind of considerations as well that you guys have to think about, or like how do
Yes.
you kind of deal with those responses?
No, we do have to think about, and we try to think about them early on, and we challenge each other to make sure if someone thinks of something that we react quickly during the production. But those things are more likely to slip in because you can't try everything and every possibility. Like, I mean, even if you've heavily playtest a game 6 months before releasing it, within 2 hours, there are more people who have played that game than your entire dev team and playtest
Yeah.
team combined. Within 2 hours. So, like, within a day, like they've tried everything that you could not have had time to try. So like there are things that are going to slip through, especially through any kind of emergent gameplay. We worry less about that because intention is important in that case, and people will understand in general. It's very rare that you'll find people who are called out for something that was clearly not put into place intentionally, but things like that do slip in. I could give an example that I heard of from a studio that was in Montreal. I remember that the issue was after the game launched, someone realized that male characters were doing more damage over time than female characters, and they were otherwise identical. All their stats were identical, everything was, and they couldn't figure out why until frame by frame they realized that the animation for the attack animation was a couple of frames longer on the female character, and that made it. Yeah, that was it. It was honest mistake. They didn't like they marketed it as play as male or female. They're exactly the same. Back then, it was a big deal. It was like from 9 years ago or something. There was zero intention from the dev team to actually make the male characters better. And they fixed it in a patch like shortly after. As soon as someone figured it out, they're like, oh crap, a week later, update, there you go. It's gone. The animations are in sync now. And it just didn't come up. And later I found out from friends who worked in the studio that it was a bug that got resurfaced. So they caught it during production. They fixed it, and then some other bug happened, so they rolled back that fix. And they kept going. And it just never came up again. They never tested exactly for that. It was very, very close to the end of the ship. And they just didn't notice that they reintroduced that bug again. So those kind of things happen. People reacted negatively until they made a statement of, this is a mistake and we will fix it ASAP. And it died down like within a day or so. So that kind of thing can still happen. Like I said, we're still humans. It's the we don't care. This is our messaging. This is the vision I have for the game. Those are the problematic things that thankfully don't happen as often on like especially bigger productions than they used to before, because people are a lot more sensitive. We get sensitivity training all the time, and that's a good thing, right?
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like for the studios you're working in, there's a lot of kind of levels and layers that the game goes through, both in testing, but also in terms of like creative direction. Like it sounds like it's very much kind of a few people have like the direction, and then the other people working beneath them are kind of meant to kind of reflect that, and it goes through many hours of testing. And what I'm kind of curious is because we've also interviewed some like indie studios and designers, and you've also set up some place for independent people. Like what are some major differences in terms of like thinking about humor for you in your position now versus like an indie designer?
Yeah, so I was indie when the other room that I spoke about, that was an indie studio that released it. It was definitely not on a AAA budget. We still hire consultants, but we have way less budget to do that. And I know a lot of indies don't have any budget to do that. So a lot of times what they do is they will try to do play tests where we just order pizza and have people play it and try to catch as much as we can. It's the scopes are smaller, so having a focus on the content is easier than the bigger games where the scope is bigger, but you have fewer people and less budget to catch things. But also I find people are more forgiving of indies, and for a good reason, right? In general, people understand all of this. And so if an indie dev makes a faux pas, it's not going to be as widespread in the media. It's not going to hit them back as hard. People are going to be more likely to send them a message over Twitter and say, this offends me, can you change it, than they would be, how could you have done this? Like the tone will be more forgiving. This is my experience. I don't know how other people's experiences are.
Right.
But from my experience, whenever we release something in indie, people see it through an indie lens, and they don't expect it to be as thorough. They're more forgiving, and I hope that stays, because that's justified. I've been on both sides of the fence, and it's not the same budgets. It's not the same processes. A lot of times for indies, we just don't have enough time to even test the thing, let alone play test the thing. You know what I mean? Like we're just crunching the bugs at the very end just to make sure it doesn't crash a week before release. But that's a very likely scenario. So I hope people are more forgiving of that. I know I am.
Yeah. No, that makes a lot of sense. I'm kind of curious though too, if like for indie devs, if they can kind of be like, oh, this is something funny that we want to talk about, and it might be a little like politically edgy, they kind of have more freedom to go about doing that, would you say, than you might have in your own larger kind of AAA studio?
Yeah, absolutely. There's no question about that. And this is across any of the studios I worked in. Like at Gameloft, we had a list of topics that we couldn't bring up, and there are a lot of reasons for this, of course, but mostly it's just to mitigate risk. I mean, it's a risk reward. It's a goal of these big companies, obviously, is to make money. So um, if the controversy is likely to lose you sales, that's the thing that's going to end up on the cutting room floor. While for indies, like especially smaller indies where it's like artistic endeavor, so they're more like, no, this is the messaging I want to get across. That kind of like in bigger productions, the goal is more to stay safe, and that makes a lot of sense. It's the same reason why we have like big productions that are more sequels, because that's more likely to be easier to market, and like it follows the trends. Like don't take a risk, don't rock the boat. Like unless it's calculated. Like I'm not saying don't take any risk at all, but I mean for something like this, why would you take the risk if it doesn't actually bring anything to your game? Just like leave it out, especially because they're like the reach of AAA games is so much wider. You have to find something that doesn't offend almost literally the entire globe, right? Like I know that's impossible, but like there's a Venn diagram of what doesn't offend anyone at all. That's very, very tiny.
Right.
So it's more about the bell curve. What can you get that's near the middle of that? Thankfully, like we're getting better at that craft to figure out how we could do that. So without like we're getting better at like sensitivity training for example, what would offend Chinese, the Chinese market or European market or things like that. So we don't step on toes as much. But even then, like I this is not my personal experience. I played through Ghost of Tsushima and I absolutely loved it. But I was very curious about how do you handle a writing a game in Japan for, but like the game is written by Western authors. So I read up a lot about that, and I actually saw that a lot of Japanese writers online, especially one that I follow on Twitter, was saying, or actually, I'm not 100% sure she's Japanese, but she's definitely from that part of the world. But what she was writing is that the take on that game specifically from Japanese audiences isn't, oh, they did us right, but it's more like, oh, how cute, this is what they think of us. So but they play tested and they made sure they weren't offensive, but it doesn't make them authentic. It's not the same thing.
Right.
But they're still within that Venn diagram of we can exist without annoying people or offending people, which is fine. When if an indie dev would have maybe went a little bit further or stumbled, they would have been more easily forgiven for obvious reasons, but their reach would have been less wide as well.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Just kind of jumping back a little bit to the communities and how they react to these games. We talked a little bit about spectatorship and live streaming. I'm wondering if like meme culture has ever been kind of a thought, specifically for like community managers or kind of how you engage with your community, because we see a lot of games, the community themselves will like make a lot of memes around it and make jokes from it, some of which can be quite offensive or become political, and that's their own doing, not the designers doing. Are these considerations that you guys have when you're making the game, kind of how it will be taken up in those ways?
Specifically, if the memes are going to become offensive, is that the question?
Or just kind of meme culture in general? Is that something that kind of has become now on your radar?
Yeah, absolutely. We always have like email threads or Slack channels where it's like, hey, these are the memes that are being made of our game. The ones that are shared are curated by our community manager team, or in the odd chance that someone shares something from the dev team that's like, this maybe you shouldn't share that. It's quickly dealt with and deleted, and we move on from those. It rarely happens, but once in a while, someone that doesn't think and doesn't realize that, hey, that joke making fun of pregnant women, maybe don't put that in. You know what I mean? Yeah. So like usually like we're quick to react for situations like that, but no, we are. I don't like the term, but we are gamers as well. We play games and we're part of that culture, and we do that for other games. I remember one of the people on a team I worked on, when memes first started appearing for our game, that was her first game that was revealed ever. So for her reaction was, wow, I'm on this side now, for the first time ever, I'm usually the one who's creating the fan art and the memes for the games I love, and that was an emotional experience for her. But so this is something that we do think about. We see all the time. We're all on Reddit. We're on the Discords and all the different things for our own games, as well as usually incognito. Usually you don't know that we're there. We're lurking, but we see it and we engage with it as well, telling sometimes anonymously telling the fans, no, that's not right, or that's not how the character was intended, because we care. This is these are our babies, right? Collectively.
Yeah. No, that makes a ton of sense. I actually think it's really interesting you talking about like the flip and how it's almost like rewarding to find that people are finally making a meme of something that you made. That's really cool.
I spent the last 2 days while working watching reaction videos. I told you I'm sorry I got back to you so late. I don't have an excuse other than I was extremely distracted.
No, when you dropped the announcement, we're like, oh, this is why. There's not a problem at all.
I'm sorry. The few days leading up to that, and the few days afterwards, I was like, the emails not answering, messages I'm not there. I was a different person, so apologies.
No, not at all. Don't worry about it. Okay, so I have 2 questions left for you.
Yes.
One, and this is maybe the hardest one, or maybe the easiest one, but how do you personally define humor? Like, what is humor to you?
It's probably going to be the hardest one because I don't know other than something that makes you laugh. I don't know beyond that. Humor is something that makes you laugh or makes you have the feeling that you want to laugh, even if the actual sounds don't come out of your mouth.
No, that we're kind of we're asking everyone it and kind of seeing what kind of themes. The last question I have, and it's one I ask everyone: are there any other pieces that you thought we talk about today that we didn't get a chance to talk about, or anything that you wanted to bring up that we just I never asked the right question to kind of get there?
No, I was actually expecting more questions about like the breakdown of the dev team, but like it's actually pretty straightforward. Like we have creative direct, like who would be involved in the creation of humor. So it's pretty straightforward. We have the creative director on top to set the tone. We also have a narrative director to actually write the story beats, narrative designers as well who have a say in it. We have mission designers who, like, a lot of missions are humorous in of themselves. Like basically the mission itself can come from the mission designer, or it could come from the narrative designer, or it could come from the level designer. It could come from a lot of different sources, but a lot of times it's the dialogue that's humorous, and a lot of times it's the setup itself that's humorous. Then we have the script writers who try to put humor in anywhere, and we're not just talking about in the VOs. It could be in the description of some items. It could be in your achievements. It could be, or trophy descriptions or whatever it is. There's so many opportunities to have humor in things. Like I mentioned before, even the artists, like some of the concept art, some of the sketches for, like, I don't know, like storefronts or like T-shirts designs or whatever, depending on the kind of game you're like. If you're working on a game like Watch Dogs, then you have like or any game in a real life setting that allows customization of your characters. Just having a funny T-shirt is a choice, right? Someone had to make it, someone had to approve it at some point. Or storefront, maybe they have like what was it? GTA and Saints Row. They have all these really funny stores that are like parodies of real world stores in some situations, right? Was it their version of Apple? Was it Pear? I don't remember, but like that kind of thing. All like. It's really a team effort. A lot of different departments are implicated in it, and of course, for indies, it's the same people, except usually those same people are just one person, right. Or like a few people, a handful of people. But it's the same. It still scales down to indies as well.
That was our interview with Osama Dorias. Thanks again to the Tag Lab for supporting the series, and thanks to you for listening.